Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to install the Havoc Offroad 5.5 inch lift kit on this 2017 Dodge Ram 2500 6.4 liter Hemi. Now before you get started, you need to know that there's going to be a little bit of cutting and drilling involved in the installation. So just make sure you read through the instructions and that you're comfortable with it. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so the first thing that we got, guys, is we got the truck jacked up. We got the wheels and tires off the front and the rear. Now the first thing that we're going to do is remove the front track bar bolt from the frame rail here. So that's going to be a 1 inch and 1/16 on the front, and it's got a flag nut on the back. So now you're going to want to make sure that your axle is supported, and we got a hydraulic jack underneath of it just to make sure it's well supported and nothing funny is going to happen. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to break the jam nuts loose on the adjusting collar of the drag link here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to disconnect the tie rod from the pitman arm. Now make sure that when you're getting this off, you don't damage this boot on the back, and then you're also going to mark the orientation of the pitman arm once you remove it. Alright, so once you get that nut off, you're going to want to just thread it back on a couple threads, and we're actually just going to hit it with a hammer to kind of break this loose. Okay, so we tried to smack this a couple times with a hammer. It wasn't coming loose. Now we don't want to damage these threads at all, so we went ahead and got out our pitman arm puller. Now if you don't already have one of these, you can go ahead and pick one up from your local parts store or just rent one, but that's what we're going to use to get this out. Now it's loose. Now we're going to go ahead and mark the orientation of our pitman arm. So now that you have the orientation marked, you can just go ahead and pull the pitman arm off. Okay, so now that we got the nut off, you can see that this isn't going anywhere, so we're going to get our pitman puller again and pull this arm right off. So now we're going to disconnect the sway bar links from the sway bar on both sides. We're going to use an 18mm to do that. So since the ball was spinning, we're going to use an 8mm at the top to hold it while we turn the 18mm. Okay, so now we're going to use a 13mm to remove the brake line bracket from the actual axle, and we're going to do that on both sides. Okay, so now we're going to disconnect the factory shock and from the lower shock mount, and we're actually going to lower the axle so that we can get the springs out. So we're going to do that one side at a time, but we're going to do that on both sides. And that's just a 21mm socket, and it's got a flag nut on the opposite side. Okay, so now we have the factory shocks undone on both sides. We're going to go ahead and lower our jacks down slowly, and then we can remove our coil springs on both sides. Okay, so now that we got our coil springs out, we're actually going to jack it back up and put just the bolt through for our shock, so it'll just kind of hold our axle in place. Okay, so now we have our radius arm. We need to install the bushings in the metal sleeve. So to do that, we sprayed them down with a little bit of heavy-duty silicone, and then we're just kind of push them into place. You might have to use a press for this, but we're going to try to just use our hands for right now. There you go, one side went in great. Alright, and you're going to go ahead and do that to both radius arms. Okay, and once you get the bushings and the sleeve in there, you're also going to want to make sure you put your Zerg fitting in there and grease it. So as you're tightening your Zerg fitting, you're going to want to make sure it's oriented down so that you can service it later. So now we're going to remove our radius arm. When you're doing this, you might also want to loosen the opposite side, maybe take a bolt out so you have a little bit of wiggle room in there to get this one out and get the new one in. So this bolt that's up by the shock might be a little bit more difficult to get out just because of its location. We're going to use a little pry bar and just kind of pull it out. There we go. So when you get your new radius arm in there, you're going to just use your factory hardware. It might be a little bit tight, so you just have to wiggle it around. And you want to make sure before you put that bolt all the way through that you have your flag nut on there. Because with the cross member in the way, if you put the bolt all the way through, you're not going to get the flag nut on. So at this point, our shock has kind of gotten in our way, so we just took that bolt out. It was fairly loose because we have the axle supported pretty good on this side. So we're just going to kind of push that out of the way for right now until we get this top bolt in. Okay, so to get the bottom bolt in on the driver's side, we're actually going to take out the bottom bolt of the radius arm on the passenger side so that we can kind of rotate the axle a little bit to get that bottom bolt in. So when you're tightening these bolts down, you just want to make sure that this is oriented so that the cam is facing inside those little brackets there. So now that we have the lower bolt in on the driver's side radius arm, we're going to do the exact same on the passenger side radius arm. Okay, so now that we have both radius arms in, we're going to tighten the hardware that attaches the arm to the axle to 200 foot-pounds, and we're going to leave the hardware in the back loose at this time. Okay, so now we're going to take out our factory bump stops on the passenger and driver side, and to do that we're just going to smack it on the side with a hammer until it just kind of pops out. Okay, now we have our new bump stop, and we sprayed some silicone spray on there. You can use silicone spray, you can use grease, any kind of lubricant really would work, but we're just going to jack up the axle on this side until it hits that bump stop, and we're going to use that momentum to just kind of push it in there. And just like that, you can see it's in place now, and then we can lower the axle back down. And repeat that process on the passenger side as well. Okay, so now we're going to want to install our track bar bracket. And it's going to install right where the original track bar went in with the factory hardware. But before we do that, we got another hole here, which is going to line up with this factory hole here, which needs to be clearance to 1/2 inch. And then this hole is going to line up with this hole right here in the cross member, which needs to be clearance out to 9/16. So we're going to do that right now. Okay, so now that we've got our holes clearanced, we can put our track bar bracket in place. Where the original track bar was, we're going to use the factory hardware and put that bolt through with the flag nut on the back. And then we're going to use some provided hardware for the other two locations. So you have a bolt with a tab, and they provide you with a little bit of wire to thread that on there so you can kind of fish it through that top hole in the cross member. So once you get that through, it should be relatively easy. And you're just going to pull that through, unthread the wire, and then you're going to have a thick washer and a nut that's going to go on the end of that. So now we have a factory 1.5 inch bolt with a washer, and you're just going to thread that in from the back, and then on the front you're going to have another washer and a nut. like that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and tighten down our provided hardware. We're going to tighten that down to 65 foot-pounds. And then we're going to tighten our factory hardware to 250 foot-pounds. Okay, so now we're going to use an 18mm to remove the top mount for the shocks. We're going to remove the passenger and driver's side shock at this time. Once we have the shock off, we want to retain the lower mounting hardware because we're going to reuse that, but we don't need the top part. Okay guys, so since this is a gas model, we don't have to do any re-indexing or anything like that. We can just go ahead and put our new coils in with the factory isolator. Now they are marked driver and passenger side, so just make sure that you grab the right one. And you're going to have to lower the axle pretty far to get these in there. But once you do, it should just slip in, and then you can go ahead and raise it back up. And on your factory isolator, there's going to be a little locating pin, and you want to make sure that goes back into the hole. So on that little locating pin, you might want to put some silicone or some grease to just make sure it slides in there easily. Okay, so now we're going to put our bushings into our shock. And to do that, again, we're going to use some silicone spray or any grease, anything like that. And you're just going to push that in there. Sometimes these can be a pain. You might have to use a vise, you might have to use a hammer to get it in. So again, if you can push it in by hand, that's best. It's supposed to look just like that. Metal sleeve, again, we're going to spray that with some silicone. And push that in there just like that. You might want to flip it over and press on it because you want it to be nice and flush against that rubber bushing. Okay, so now we got our new shock with our provided washer and bushing on the bottom. So you're going to put that through, and then a bushing and a washer, and then a 1/2-inch nut on the top of that. And you can go ahead and tighten that down until the bushing starts to swell a little bit, and that's when you know it's tight enough. Okay, so now we're going to use factory hardware to reinstall the bottom mount, and we're going to tighten that down to 65 foot-pounds. You're going to go ahead and repeat that process on the other side. Okay guys, now that our shocks are in place, we're going to disassemble the drag link. And to do that, we're just going to twist this, since we already loosened it in the beginning. Just like that. Just like that. Now what we're going to do, since we have that disassembled, is we're actually going to cut the tab off here, and we're going to cut the tab off on the other side as well. So this is flush. Okay, so we're going to use a little cut-off wheel, and we're just going to cut this tab off. So now we're going to do the same thing to this side. We're just going to cut it so that it's flush right here. Okay, so now we're going to reassemble the drag link, and so this is just going to be a starting point, but you're going to want to make sure that you have about 3/4 of an inch to 7/8 of an inch of thread exposed past each side of the jam nut. And again, like I said, it's just going to be a starting point. It's obviously going to have to be adjusted once you get the truck back together. Okay, so now we're going to install the new pitman arm, and you're going to use that alignment mark that we made earlier to make sure it's on correctly. And then you're just going to put the factory lock washer and nut back on. You want to make sure you use some red Loctite in there because you don't want that thing to come off. Okay, so before we tighten down the pitman arm, we're going to go ahead and reinstall the drag link. And that's just a factory nut that's going on there. And that'll just kind of hold everything in place as we tighten it down. We're going to tighten down the drag link to 65 foot-pounds and tighten down the other end of the pitman arm to 225 foot-pounds. Okay, so now we're going to remove our brake line brackets, passenger and driver side, we're going to remove. Okay, so now we have our relocation bracket for our brake line, and we're going to use 2 bolts. The factory bolt is going to go back through the threaded hole, and then we have a self-tapping bolt that is going to go through the other hole. And we're going to go ahead and tighten those down with a 13mm. Okay, now that we have the bolts in, we can go ahead and put our brake line into the bracket, and then we can retain it with our factory retaining clip. Okay, so now we're going to remove the two bolts holding on our sway bar on the passenger side. We're going to drop that, use the factory bolts with our drop brackets, and then use our new hardware to attach our sway bar to our drop brackets. Okay, so you're going to repeat that process to put the bracket in on the other side as well. Okay, so now we're going to reattach this to our sway bar end links, and we're just going to use factory hardware. Tighten that. And now these brackets are adjustable back and forth. What we're going to do is adjust them all the way forward and then tighten these down to 35 foot-pounds, and then we're going to tighten down the nut on the sway bar end link to 45 foot-pounds. Okay guys, so now we're going to remove the steering stabilizer, and that's going to be two 18mm bolts, and then they have flag nuts at the top. Okay guys, so I got my steering stabilizer, my rubber bushings, and my metal sleeves. So we need to install these before we put this on the truck. I'm going to use my silicone spray to get this in there. Once you get them in, they should look like that. And then you can usually the metal sleeve just pushes in pretty easily. Just make sure it's flush. And then you're going to do the same thing on the other side. There we go. Okay, you're going to install the new steering stabilizer just basically the same way as you took the other one out. And it's going to use the factory hardware. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten those down. Okay guys, so now we are pretty much done with the front. I know we have the track bar here that still needs to go in, and there's still a couple bolts that need to be tightened, but we're going to do all that stuff when it's actually on the ground underneath its own weight. So the front's done for right now. We're going to go ahead and head to the rear of the truck. Okay, so now we're in the rear of the truck, and the first thing that we're going to do is remove the track bar from the axle. That's going to be a 21mm on the front, and it's got a flag nut on the back. So the next thing we're going to do is completely remove our sway bar end links on both the passenger and driver side. That's going to be an 18mm here on the bottom with an 8mm to hold it, and two 18mm at the top. Okay, so with the axle well supported, now we're going to remove the shocks on both sides, and that's going to be two 21mm on the bottom. We're going to go ahead and do that on the passenger and driver side. Okay, so now we're going to take the top nut off the shock. This is going to be an 18mm, and you might have to reach inside because you can't really get in through this side without taking the inner fender well out. But if you just reach on the inside, it's really no big deal. And it should come out just like that. Alright, so now that we got both shocks out, we can take our coil springs out. So what we're going to do is we're going to lower both of our jacks at the same time and until they come loose, and then we'll just fish them out. Okay, so now we're on the driver's side, and this rearmost hole here that you can see after you take the coil spring out needs to be clearance to a 1/2 inch to accept some new hardware that's going to go with our bracket that relocates our track bar. Okay, so our bracket for the track bar is going to fit right over the factory location. So we're going to have to pull out this little retaining clip here. Just pull it down like that. This is going to fit right over this like so. And then in the hole that you just drilled, you're going to get some 7/16 provided hardware. You're going to feed that in from the top, and it's going to be the bolt, washer, and then on the bottom you're going to put another washer and a nut. And you can just leave that loose for right now. And then you got another bolt and provided washer. It's going to come up through the bottom, and it's going to have a washer and a nut. So once you have those 2 bolts in, you can stick your factory bolt right through the middle with that metal sleeve in there, and it should just go right through to the other side. And then you're going to use your flag nut on the other side. Okay, so once you get that bolt started in there, you can get your flag nut on the back of it and just give it a few turns. Okay, so now that we have our track bar bracket in, we're going to go ahead and tighten down all these bolts. We're going to start with the bottom one, and that's going to be tightened down to 35 foot-pounds. So the next one that we're going to tighten down is the hole that we drilled out that's right by our coil mount, and we're going to tighten that bolt down to 45 foot-pounds. So now we're going to tighten down our factory bolt in the middle, and we're going to tighten that to 95 foot-pounds. Okay, so now we're going to have to lower our axle because we're going to be putting in the new coil springs, and so we're going to have to lower this down quite a bit to allow the clearance. So we've lowered our axle as far as it'll go, and we tried to get our new coil springs in, but we still didn't have enough clearance, so we're actually going to remove the bolt, the factory bolt, holding on the shock in the middle, so that we have a little bit more drop for the axle. Okay guys, now to get this coil spring in here, we actually had to remove the 2 brackets holding on our parking brake on the driver's side because that line was getting a little bit tight. So we removed those brackets, and we're also going to have one person with the coil spring put it up there, and another person is actually going to be pulling down on the axle just to give a little bit more room. And you want to use both of your factory isolators as well. And the one on the bottom, the location tab needs to be facing towards the rear. So once you get it in there, kind of jack the axle back up to let it seat in place. Okay guys, so now we're going to put the shocks together for the rear. So you're going to have 2 bushings, one for the top, one for the bottom. There you go. Once you get the rubber bushing in, you can just put the metal sleeve through pretty easily. Okay, so once you have your bushings and sleeve in, we're going to put in our stem eliminator. And that's going to be this piece here with a provided bolt and flat washer with another washer and a nut on the end. And then you should have another large washer and a large nut, and those are just going to go on the top for when you install it. Okay, and you're going to do the same thing on the other rear shock as well. Okay guys, so now we're going to install the shocks. Your stem eliminator is going to go up through the hole, and on the top you're going to have a washer and a nut. I'm going to go ahead and just get that started for right now. And then we'll just raise up the axle until we get it lined up. Run that bolt through, again with the factory hardware. So we can go ahead and tighten those down on the driver and passenger side. Okay guys, so now we're going to install our bushings and sleeves into our sway bar links. And we're going to do those the same as we did the shocks. Just going to lube them up here with some silicone and just push them through. Just like that. Once you get that through, the sleeve goes in pretty easily. Just make sure it's nice and flush like that. And then the same thing on the other side. There we go. And sleeve. And you're going to want to do that on both sway bar end links. Okay, so now we're going to install our new sway bar links. And it's going to use a provided bolt and washer. It's going to go through the top with a washer and a nut on the back. And then same thing at the bottom. You want to run these bolts from the outside in. You might have to raise the axle up a little bit to fit. And then we'll go ahead and tighten this down until the bushings start to swell a little bit, and we'll do that on the driver's side as well. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is remove our factory bump stop so that we can add a extension bracket to the top of that. And we're going to do that on the passenger and driver side. Alright, so with our drop bracket in place, we're going to use the new provided hardware, new provided bolt with a flat washer. And it's going to thread right back into the existing holes. Once you get those bolts in, we're going to tighten those down to 35 foot-pounds. You know, we got the shocks in, we got the sway bar links in, and everything's good to go, everything's tight. So now we're going to move on to putting the track bar in, and a lot of your instructions are going to say, you know, put it on the ground, put your wheels and tires on, put it on the ground, and then kind of push the truck over and, you know, to get this bar in. But we've done a lot of these, and we found that you can kind of do it on the lift or on your jack stands if you just have a ratchet strap. And you can kind of line everything up and then just push that bolt through. So once you get that bolt through, and this is a provided bolt with a washer on the front and a washer on the back and a nut, you're going to want to tighten that down to 95 foot-pounds. Okay guys, so before we put the wheels and tires back on and set it on the ground, we're going to go back through and tighten up a couple things. The drag link here, we haven't tightened that down yet, so we're going to go ahead and do that right now. Okay, and we'll go ahead and tighten the radius arm. Make sure you do that on the passenger and driver side. And also don't forget to grease your radius arms, both driver and passenger. Okay guys, so the truck's on the ground underneath its own weight. Wheels and tires are on. So we're going to put the front track bar in now. So while somebody's underneath, we're going to have one person in the truck turning the wheel a little bit to get it aligned. And the other person is going to be underneath the truck putting the bolt through. And that's going to be a provided new bolt, washer, and then another washer on the back and a nut. So once you get that bolt in there, you can put a washer and a nut on the back, and then we're going to just go ahead and tighten that down. Okay guys, so the last thing we need to do before we take this to the alignment shop is to reinstall our stabilizing shock.
There you go. Awesome.
You're just going to reinstall that with your factory hardware. And go ahead and tighten it down. Alright guys, we just got the truck back from the alignment shop. Now after about 500 miles, you're going to want to go back underneath and make sure all your bolts are still torqued to spec. But that completes the installation. If you have any questions, give us a call or visit us online. Thanks.